Okay, so welcome everybody to the second of our CARP webinar series. It's nice to see you all on the line. Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Rakesh Popat, who is a consultant haematologist and honorary associate professor at UCLH. He is chair of the UKMRA and the chief investigator of our first CARP platform study, which he's going to be talking about to us today. So hopefully he's going to share his experiences of developing and setting up this early phase myeloma trial through CARP. So just before I start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Please keep your mic muted throughout the talk unless you have a question. You're welcome to have your camera on. We must let you know that we're recording the session so that we can make this available at a later date. If you've got any questions, please use the raise hand function, which in Zoom is in reactions. On here it says at the end, but please do, if you've got a question whilst we're going through, please do raise your hand up or comment in chat, and I'll keep an eye on that so that we can monitor that throughout. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded. We've now got a new YouTube channel, which will shortly be made available through the CTIU and the Myeloma UK website, so you can view this and other webinars through that link, which will also circulate. So I would like to hand over then to Rakesh. I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to this webinar. And it's my pleasure just to take you through a little bit about a platform trial that we are developing and hopefully will be opening later on this year. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the MRA process that we have in place to help people develop new clinical trials. So my first slide really shows about how we've been working together to develop clinical trials in the past. And this is a snapshot of the Myeloma UK Clinical Trials Network portfolio, which was in place essentially from 2010 onwards. And you can see there's a number of studies that we developed, and some of them have been very successful and have been published in high impact journal as well. Not all of them have been successful, and there's been some attrition, and some other studies have run into various other problems. But what you can see is that there's been an awful lot of effort going into developing all of these clinical trials, and associated with the effort that goes in, there's not only the time but also the expense that flows into running these studies. And it begins to make you wonder if there's a better way of running an academic program which can be more efficient and more targeted to what you want to achieve. So these are some of my thoughts as to what are the problems with running sequential trials. What you end up doing is running a portfolio which isn't integrated within itself. So you run a number of separate trials which are answering different questions. So to some extent it's coordinated because we all sit together and we decide what we want to do, but it's not really integrated with a previous trial, and there's no clear direction to where that trial may go to. And so that limits the impact of the trial that's going on. Each study, as I said, is individualized. They're planned and set up very separately from other studies. There's little crosstalk between them. And so that ends up meaning that you're setting up discrete studies, which increases the time to set up and increases the costs. And because of all these problems, what the risk is that this study could become outdated before we report the results of the study. And that's a real concern in myeloma, particularly because the pace of research is moving so rapidly. So we are competing with industry as always. And actually what we're seeing currently is that industry have changed the way that they're running studies. They're accelerating their programs, they're being more innovative. And actually academic studies soon will not be able to function unless we change the way that we want to work. So one of the ways that we can do this is by adopting a platform approach to our trials, which essentially means that we work collaboratively with industry to develop a master protocol and develop multiple arms within that. And the beauty of this is that your arms can open at different times, depending on how the negotiations are going with the companies and on the basis of emerging data. So you can set a trial up very early in the development pathway of a drug, even if you don't know all the results, on the basis that you can open another arm once the results from an earlier trial reports. And it also means that you can continue to amend the trial depending on how myeloma evolves and as new standards get approved. So this gets around the problem of running a trial which looks really interesting today, but when you report in 5 years' time, it's of no relevance because the field has moved on. And we can design it to address specific clinical needs. So things that we're looking at, for example, are those patients who aren't in, who haven't achieved MRD negativity following a stem cell transplant. Can we use one of our new immunotherapies for those MRD positive patients? The second area that we're looking at are for a high-risk group of patients who relapse very rapidly following a stem cell transplant. We know that this is a major unmet medical need, and we need to develop new drugs to address this. Then the third area which we need to look in more detail are patients who've failed standard treatment. So patients who've gone through proteasome inhibitors, immunomodulatory agents, CD38 monoclonal antibodies, so the main classes of myeloma treatment, and are now refractory to that. And we don't know what the best outcome for that is. So lining up a platform where we can look at lots of different treatments makes sense. The other way is that we can look at proof of concept studies for the development of a new agent, because we're not quite sure how that new agent will do, and we're not quite sure what the best partners for that new agent is. And it allows us in combinations to be able to decide which drug we might want to take forward. And importantly, once we've chosen what drug we want to take forward, we can integrate it into the rest of the national portfolio. So for example, we have the Myeloma 15 trial radar, which has a number of different cassettes of looking at or investigating patients who are MRD positive following a stem cell transplant. And it may be that we can develop a novel treatment in an early phase trial, which we can move forward into the Myeloma 15 trial and inform that study further. So this is about integration of our portfolio and really getting more value for the studies that we're running, and actually more value for the patients who are being enrolled into our trials. So these are some examples of what we can do. This is an example of a master protocol where patients enter in at the front end and are randomized to multiple different treatments. And this typically is against a control arm. It's a proof of concept, and the idea is that we can feed this into another larger clinical trial, such as Myeloma 15, a phase 3 clinical trial. And here are some examples of how these sorts of trials have already taken place. This is a solid tumor study called Focus 4. It's quite a complex study. I'm not going to take you through all the details, but essentially what you can see is that patients are selected according to initial criteria. They undergo molecular selection, and according to their molecular genotype, they are then randomized to receive either standard of care arms or to the addition of a novel treatment on the basis of their molecular profile. And you assess how that comes. And that has a lot of attraction in multiple myeloma. What this does mean is that you have to combine with multiple industry partners, and that becomes a bit of a challenge when you're dealing with lots of different drugs, but it can be overcome. And so this is an example of what's happening in myeloma. This is the MyDrug protocol, which is being led by the MMRF, and Shaji Kumar in the US is the lead investigator. So it's an example of how these trial designs can happen. This is for patients with high-risk myeloma who then undergo gene sequencing using a OncoSeq platform to identify various different targetable mutations. And essentially all patients get a combination of ixazomib, pomalidomide, and dexamethasone. And then according to which aberration is identified, they are then given a drug which targets that aberration. And they initially receive that drug and for 2 cycles, and then you get the addition of ixazomib, pomalidomide, and dexamethasone on top of that. And patients who don't have a genetic aberration get daratumumab with ixapomdex. So this is an example of how you can run a very large clinical trial with multiple different partners. Now, this trial took a lot of effort and had the strength of the MMRF behind them to negotiate multiple different industry partners to come together to give these novel agents. Because if you don't get that buy-in from industry, then that's unfortunately where your trial fails. You need these novel agents to be able to move forward. And we're looking at something like this potentially to move in for our next frontline clinical trial. It's a concept that we're currently working up. Now, the other idea is to work with a single industry partner, which is potentially a little bit easier, where we use that drug from that company and we try and combine it with potentially other drugs. And that's the approach that we've taken forward, because that tends to be a little bit more straightforward to look at. So just to try and conceptualize this a little bit more, this is essentially how this works. And I'd like to just credit Andrew, Hall and Sarah for some of these slides, which I've pinched. But it essentially describes how these platforms can take place. So you have patients coming in at different points. They will be randomized to standard of care or to different treatment arms. And this carries on moving forward, and then we can open up different arms as time goes on, and patients can flow into these different arms. So these trials can stay open for a longer period of time and can be amended and modulated as time goes on. And you can see that that makes it a much more efficient use. What we don't want to do is to be spending too much time enrolling patients into a control treatment. We want to maximize patients being enrolled into the experimental phases. And so what you can do is and Andrew talks about this really nicely when he talks to me about platform studies, is to stop and start. And I think you may have even used the term, Andrew, flip-flop design. But essentially what that does is allow patients to channel into either experimental arms or control arms, depending on the nature of the study. So the momentum of the study continues at pace. So you're not wasting time, you're not wasting resources, and patients are flowing either into experimental arms or control arms, depending on where that study is at that time point. So we've taken that forward, and we've chose to work with Philanthrophodotin, which is an antibody drug conjugate, which is now licensed for multiple myeloma. And the reason why I decided to work with that is because we were working on the first in human study of belantamab-mafodotin, which is known as DREAM-1. And DREAM-1 essentially looked at this drug as monotherapy for patients with relapsed myeloma. The eligibility criteria was fairly broad because it was the first in human study. And what we saw was that for these patients, the overall response rate was 60%. With a significant proportion of patients achieving a very deep response. That's a very good partial response or greater. And this is a waterfall plot. And at the bottom side, you can see the depth of response. So the significant reductions in paraproteins for the patients with this single drug. So that was clearly something very impressive that we saw, and is a new modality of treatment. And we wanted to explore this further. So we started to work with GSK to think about how we could move belantamab further up in the treatment pathway and what rational combinations we could think about using. And this cartoon really just shows you belantamab. It's an antibody drug conjugate that is able to kill myeloma cells in the multiple different mechanisms of action. So whilst we were setting up that clinical trial, the phase 2 trial, which is DREAM-2, opened and closed very rapidly. And this has now been published, and DREAM-2 has led to the licensing both in the US and in the EU of belantamab-mafodotin. Essentially, the DREAM-2 clinical trial looked at quite a difficult to treat population of patients. This is a triple refractory group, which are patients who have stopped responding to a proteasome inhibitor, an immunomodulatory agent, and a CD38 antibody. And we recognize that this is a hard to treat population. What we found was that the overall response rate was 32%. Again, a significant proportion of patients are achieving deep responses. And for those patients who do respond, their response duration was 11 months. So we then had additional information coming through from DREAM2 to help us develop this. And what we also found from DREAM2 was that the significant side effect was to the eyes. And what happens, and these are pictures of the front surface of the eye or the cornea, is that there is deposition of the antibody, or what we think is the antibody, on the front surface of the cornea. And on the bottom pictures, you can see these white splodges, and that just demonstrates these cysts that we find being deposited on the front surface of the eye. And essentially 72% of patients develop keratopathy, which is the deposits on the front surface of the eye, of which just 52% are symptomatic. So there's about 20% of patients are asymptomatic from that, and a much smaller proportion have changes in the visual acuity. But clearly that was the major side effect profile for that. And so as we were developing this clinical trial, we were able to take these things into consideration. And then as we continued to develop this, the commercial pipeline continued to rattle through very fast. And this is the thing with industry, they move rapidly forward with their commercial development pipeline. And I was working with GSK in the DREAM6 phase 1 trial, which is looking at the combination of belantamab with the proteasome inhibitor bortezomib. And in this phase 1 clinical trial, which we reported at ASH, we saw that the overall response rate was 78%. Those patients being treated at second relapse, so one prior line of treatment, all patients responded, although there was only 4 patients in our group. But you can clearly see there's some very high response rates appearing once you start combining belantamab with a proteasome inhibitor. So this is what we have ended up designing, and this is the PROMISE clinical trial. This is a platform trial, which is investigating belantamab mafodotin in combination with standard of care treatments. And essentially what we've decided to do is to move this earlier up in the treatment pathway on the basis of some of the emerging results that we've been seeing. So this is suitable for patients who've had between 1 and 3 prior lines. So we're not looking at that triple class refractory population. We're looking at a much earlier group of patients. And patients will be randomized to receive belantamab monotherapy, which is the control arm. And you can see by the shape of this triangle that we will minimize the number of patients who are entering into the control arm. And what we want to do is to maximize patients being enrolled into the treatment arms. The first treatment arm will be belantamab with low-dose cyclophosphamide and dexamethasone. The rationale for that is that low-dose cyclophosphamide and dexamethasone has some immunomodulatory effects and may augment the activity of the antibody belantamab, but also because cyclophosphamide is a relatively cheap agent. And when you think about the way the UK funds treatments, we need to think about cost-effective treatments which are relevant to our healthcare system and indeed other healthcare systems outside of the US. And so this made sense to be investigated as a combination. Now, this combination has not been assessed before, so we will have to look at this combination in terms of safety and toxicity before we can take it any further. The next combination, which is currently in evaluation, is building on this by adding in a proteasome inhibitor. I showed you the results of DREAM6. We know that belantamab plus a proteasome inhibitor is very effective, particularly in patients with 1 to 3 prior lines. So we're building on the trial by adding in a proteasome inhibitor to the cyclophosphamide and dexamethasone arm, which we've already got. So you can see that we have monotherapy, we have a triplet, and then we build on that and we have a 4-drug combination. And the advantage of this platform is that we can amend the trial as we go on and put in and slot in another arm as time goes on and new data emerges. We have been looking at other arms, but it's an incredibly competitive field. There's lots and lots of studies happening with belantamab, both through the company and both through other investigators, and it's incredibly competitive. So some of the proposals that we've put forward haven't been successful because other groups have already beat us to it. But that's not to say that we can't add treatments as we go along. Now, the other aspect that we're looking at into is to try and investigate the ocular side effects in a bit more detail. And the reason that we can do this is because we've developed a very strong collaboration with Moorfields Eye Hospital and the ophthalmologists there. And we're going to use that strength of the collaboration to set up an ocular sub-study where once we're past the initial phase of dose finding and dose confirmation, patients will be randomized to continuing to receive the combination or to receive treatment where their treatments will be directed by a hematologist as opposed to an ophthalmologist. And we're currently working this proposal up, and hopefully that will be able to be slotted into the trial as we evolve. So as you can see, even though this trial is very close to opening, there's a lot of unknown bits to this trial, and that's the beauty of a platform approach. You don't have to have all your ducks in a row to begin with. You can open the trial and the trial can evolve as time goes on, and we can keep up to date and future-proof this trial. So that's the platform trial. And then I wanted to just move on and to just talk about how investigators can try and develop a clinical trial and the advantages of working within the MRA and indeed within the CTRU at Leeds and the CARP program. So this is the process which I did, and is probably a reasonable process that I would recommend people to do. The first thing is you have to identify the question that you want to ask. So you need to think to yourself, well, what is the problem that we're facing in myeloma? What am I seeing day to day in clinic is a problem that we are not clearly addressing through current clinical trials which are under evaluation. And you can think particularly about a disease problem or a therapeutic problem or something specific to the UK. So once you've identified that, then you need to think about how you might want to address that. So you need to develop a process as to how you might answer that question. So you might think about a clinical trial, which is randomized against a control. You might think about a historical control, or you might not even need a control. You then need to develop that, and that's the point when an investigator starts to need some input and some expert input, I would advise. And we have two mechanisms through which you can do that. The UKMRA is the national study group, and we would require investigators to present the concept to the senior leadership team. Within the senior leadership team, we have a number of key clinical investigators, and we also have David Cairns, who is a statistician at Leeds CTRU. So we have statistical input as well as some very senior and experienced clinicians. And so we'd want your concept to be presented to us so we can decide whether or not that concept is relevant and is viable. Now, if that concept is not viable, then we will say that you need to go back and think about it, and we'll also advise you with how you may do that and assign some mentoring to help that proceed. And it may be at that stage you then go to the CARP, because potentially if this is an early phase idea, and you can discuss with the team within the CARP, and again there's statisticians and a whole team within the CTRU where you can get some expert advice. You need to ensure that your concept is future-proof. I've already said that this is a major pitfall for trials. It does take time to develop a profile, to get the concepts together, to get contracts together, and to open and close a trial and report. There's no point running a trial if when you report the field has moved on. You've got to future-proof your concept. Now, once you've got your concept in a reasonable state, you're then ready to pitch the concept to industry. You should. I don't think it's advisable to pitch a concept until you've got these things in place, because your industry partner is going to say to you, well, how many patients do you want to enroll? How fast do you think you're going to be able to enroll? And when do you think you can present some results? And what sort of costs do you think you're looking at? So you need to have those ideas in mind, and that's where the CARP and the MRA leadership team can really help you with that. It's often an idea to talk to industry early, but certainly you should have these concepts in place and these ideas in place before you pitch your concept to industry. industry normally give you some feedback. They'll normally say to you, well, this is of interest, or this is not of interest, or if you tweak it, it might be of interest. So you come back, you evolve your concept and take it back, and then hopefully your industry partner gives you the green light, and then you can submit a fully worked up proposal to your industry partner. Normally you'll get some more feedback, you take it back to the CTRU that you're working with, and you evolve your proposal again, go back to industry, and it's an iterative process until you finally are able to open your study. So it is a bit of a long process. Once you've got approval, then you need to start getting things in motion. You need to form a group. A trial is not all about one person. It's incredibly important to be collaborative. You need people to be working with you to optimize your trial, to be getting new ideas in, and to get a different skill mix. So you form your trial management group. Very important to get patient involvement as early as possible. And thank you very much for Myeloma UK for helping to provide patient involvement into the research that we're doing. A big stumbling block is to agree the funding, and that's where the CTRU are experts in, and Sadie works her magic with her Excel spreadsheets to get you a sum that you need to negotiate with your funder, whether it's industry, whether it's a charitable organization. Without money, you will not be able to move forward with your clinical trial. So whilst that's all going on, you need to get your contract in place. That can be difficult, particularly if you're working with multiple different partners. And it's not just industry partners, you will be working with other academic partners, as you may be wanting to do some translational work and partnering up with some laboratories. We need to be working up the protocols, writing the patient information sheets, performing safety checks, quality control. And this is really where an experienced CTRU are vital, because as an investigator, it's an awful lot of work, and you really need a really good sponsor to help you. Once you've done that, then your protocols have to be approved by the sponsor, by the person who's funding your trial. It goes through the NIHR for safety checking, and I found that process very helpful as well. And then finally, you can start setting up your studies, submitting to ethics, getting your radiation approvals in, contracting with your studies, and finally, after a very, very long process, you might be able to open your study and finally treat a patient. So it's an incredibly long process. And at every single part in that process, things can go wrong and your study can fail. So this is the process that we've built into the MRA, and I've already alluded to a lot of this. All trial concepts have to be presented to the senior leadership team. And it can only move further within the MRA if the senior leadership team agrees that it is a worthwhile process to move forward. If the SLT say no to the study, that study cannot move forward. But hopefully what we'll be able to do is that we'll be able to provide some constructive advice. You can go back to the drawing board, develop this proposal again, and come back to the senior leadership team. So that's a very important stop-go mechanism for studies to move forward. And the reason that we're building that in is to prevent a study moving to an advanced stage of development and then falling through. We want to be able to pick holes in studies at a very early stage and prevent attrition happening at a late stage. We're going to assign a senior investigator or a mentor to each proposal, and very kindly, Kui Yong, Gordon Cook, and Graham Jackson have agreed to act as mentors, and I'm sure everyone will agree that all three of those are very skilled and experienced investigators, and we would all benefit from their mentorship. We have a trials design lead, is David Cairns, and he'll be helping, and Kui Yong is our industry lead, and she can assist with liaisons with industry to get the drug that you're looking at. We need to monitor how your development goes, and we will expect a report submitted to the senior leadership team 4 times a year as to how your proposal development is going on. We'll be tracking the proposal, and our governance lead, who is Matthew Jenner, will be tracking this, and proposals that are not meeting the timelines will need to be reviewed to try and find out what is holding things up, and we may recommend restructuring or even termination if we feel that the proposal is flagging. So as you can see, we are building in what I hope will be a robust process to try and improve the number of studies which move on to successful opening, because at the moment, when you look at our portfolio, there's a huge amount of ideas. We've got some excellent clinicians and principal investigators, but unfortunately the attrition percentage is actually quite high at the moment, and we need to improve that. And so hopefully this process will assist. Working with industry is incredibly important. We can't do this alone. And we can only move forward if the concepts that we are thinking about within our group are aligned with industry priorities, because it's up to the industry partners to give us their investigational product and also to give us some funding to be able to run the trial. So it's incredibly important that our concepts are aligned with industry, and the way that we're going to try and improve that kind of that alignment is to increase our engagement with industry. And at the last CARP meeting, I talked a little bit about that, but just to put it down in writing what we're going to be doing. We're going to be holding a trials day. There's going to be between 3 to 4 pharma companies who are going to be present. They're going to be given a 10-minute block to pitch their developmental pipeline, which will be followed by a question and answer session from the entire group. Across the year, in addition to that, we're going to be scheduling up more in-depth meetings with companies who are very interested and serious about partnering up with us. That will allow them to have more time to showcase their portfolio. It will allow us to show industry what we can do, what strengths we have within the UK, the sort of data that we've already built up through all the clinical trials, and the translational opportunities that we have through the very skilled laboratories that we have. And hopefully that will allow us to align areas of collaboration and development further. So watch this space for the industry liaison. So this is my last slide, and I hope that we can have a bit of discussion afterwards, but I would argue that the platform designed for clinical trials really represents an efficient and flexible way to evaluate novel therapies. And this is going to be our first myeloma platform, but hopefully it'll be successful. But there are lots of other trial designs. It's not just platform, there's loads, and this is where you really need the expert input from Sarah, Andrew, from David and the other fantastic team at the CTRU. The UKMRA are here to provide support and to help concepts move forward into successful proposals, and we want to really reduce the risk of failures. All that hard work and effort that everyone's put in, we want to try and minimise that. And I'd really recommend the MRA Myeloma UK CARP as a vehicle by which concepts can get this full support to be able to be developed into a full protocol. So thank you very much for listening. I'll stop sharing my screen there and pass it back to Sarah.
Thank you, Rakesh. That was a really nice, very informative talk. Really appreciated that. So I'll open it up to questions. Anybody got some questions for Rakesh? I'll give you a bit of time to think. So as you've mentioned, Rakesh, that developing the PROMISE study protocol and the trial arm protocols has taken a long time to get to the point of where we're just about ready to open to recruitment. What's been sort of the major lessons that you learned through that process? What might you do if is there anything that you would do differently if you were to set up the platform again?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I guess I'm still learning as we go along. Well, one thing which I've realised is that we moved in quite early with this drug, and I think that's the right thing to do. But clearly, what's been happening is that as we've been developing ourselves, the drug has been progressing in its own development pathway, and we've been evolving our trial as more information comes through. So I think it's just incredibly important to have very close liaison with industry, so we know exactly what's going on there, and we can kind of keep abreast with our clinical trial. And I think that's probably the bit that I probably if we could have tightened up on a little bit more, particularly from my end, we could have moved a little bit faster, maybe. Particularly, I think with this way of looking at dosing from an Oculus standpoint, we had quite a few discussions internally about whether we should do it, whether we shouldn't do it, and it's one of these things where we just need to be working with industry and developing and moving quite rapidly. So I think that's the first thing from a learning perspective. The second thing is working with other sites. And you can only successfully run a study if you've got lots of other sites on board. And that's really important. And we've kind of been chopping and changing a little bit with our sites. We've got our core group, which have been working really well. And then they've changed a little bit as time goes on. That's always going to be natural because priorities always change. But it's about getting those core sites, getting the commitment and moving forward with that. The other bit that slowed us down is COVID, and I'm not sure what we can do about that, but that's slowing us down in terms of sites being able to open, because unfortunately we're not going to be able to open this study now, and probably until towards the later part of this year, simply because hospitals aren't able to open.
Yeah, I don't think COVID is specific to this study, Rakesh. Lisa, you've got a question.
Yes, it's one you may not be able to answer, Rakesh, but I'm thinking at it from a patient's point of view. How do you pitch it to what are your guinea pigs in effect? Does it tend to be the people who are in the last chance saloon? Or how do you actually, how do you get your patients? How do you pitch it to them? And if you've got nothing to lose, I can assume you'll try anything. And they maybe are not the best people to be trying drugs out in the first instance.
Yeah, okay, so that's a really good question, and I think what that talks to is the different places that we can run clinical trials. Within myeloma, we're a very research active group, and I think myeloma as a disease is a very research active area. So actually what you find is clinical trials being offered to patients right from the very diagnosis all the way through to people who have very limited standard options available. So what we've decided to do on this clinical trial is to pitch this halfway along. And the reason for doing this is because the drug that we're using or are working with is currently licensed for people who've had multiple different treatments, so further on along in the treatment pathway, and that's where the drug is available. We didn't feel confident to be able to give this to newly diagnosed patients at the moment because there are so many other options, and we felt that the trials that the industry are performing are important to be done first. But similarly, what we've realized is that this drug is extremely effective, particularly in patients who are being treated earlier. And we're seeing this across the board. The first in human study gave really good results. The DREAM-6 clinical trial I showed you in combination with Velcade, those patients we treated at first relapse, every patient responded. So we can clearly see that it becomes a lot more effective earlier in the treatment pathway. And if you think about it, that's how you maximize the effect of your treatment. It's not giving it to people so much who have very few options. If you give it earlier on in the treatment pathway, patients are likely to gain much more benefit than they would later on. So here we're going to pitch it halfway through. It's not for newly diagnosed, it's not for people who've run out of treatment options, but it's people in the middle of the pathway. And the important bit to say here is that by taking part in the clinical trial, it does not preclude you or influence or prevent you from getting any other standard treatment, because you can carry on along your NHS treatment pathway irrespective of participating in the clinical trial. Does that answer your question?
It does, yes, thank you.
Okay.
Julia, you've got a question.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Rakesh. Over the last few years, there's been sort of increasing concern about industry feeling that the UK is not necessarily attractive to work in, and that seems to have got worse over the last year, obviously with the COVID pandemic and the UK's response to that, which was to shut down sort of non-COVID research. So I'm interested to hear, what kind of engagement you've had more recently with industry and how enthusiastic they are about this initiative.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and a very question that's at the high priority to address. So it's not just COVID, it's Brexit, which hasn't helped, and the perceptions of what Brexit means to industry. So from my interactions, actually, I don't think things are too bad. I think what we are demonstrating in the UK is that we have a group or population of patients who are very interested in taking part in research. We've got a track history of recruiting very well into clinical trials. We have a very strict funding pathway within the NHS, which in some ways can be difficult to work with, but you can take advantage of that because we have a significant unmet need, which allows us to have a population of patients who can be readily recruited into clinical studies. So those are some really key aspects which we're trying to promote industry, to say, well, actually, we have a network of sites who work very well. They're all linked in within CRNs, within the NIHR, some are linked in within ECMCs. So we have this infrastructure of sites that work quite well. And we have a population of patients who are not receiving multiple treatments at first line, but are having staggered treatments due to the NHS treatment pathway, which means they're in a better place potentially to receive treatments further along the line. What I'm also seeing is that there's the reprioritization coming through the NIHR. They're now recognizing that a number of studies have been halted and are asking centers and networks to prioritize various different studies. And I hope that we can leverage that to bring some cancer studies further up the pipeline. So actually, I mean, from a personal standpoint, where I work at UCLH, we are overwhelmed with studies which are coming to us. So certainly not seeing that. And if anything, I'm turning down studies because we just can't take all the studies. And I think as we continue to perform, I would have thought it's not a problem. Just the last thing to say about that is I also believe in international collaborations. And from an academic standpoint, we are building collaborations with Europe. So we have collaborations within the European Myeloma Network, and that allows us to work with industry nicely because there's some very good engagement there. And we also have a study which we're setting up in collaboration with Australia, and that I think also makes us more attractive.
Thanks, Rakesh. Any other questions for Rakesh or comments? No? Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Rakesh. That was really interesting, very helpful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We are in the process of scheduling the future webinars. So we'll have one on patient and public involvement in the Myeloma UK clinical trials, one on phase 1 novel designs, which I expect will include some more of promise. And we also have an early career researcher session that are being scheduled over the next few months. So we'll be in touch with people about those shortly. But as mentioned, this session has been recorded and we'll put it on the YouTube channel shortly. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining. Thanks.